In this video, we are practicing our main idea and summarizing skills. And let me just remind you what these look like in our notebook. We learned about the monarch butterflies, and then we practiced that a little bit more. Now, I'm not going to be drawing these organizers because this is a much longer passage than the ones about the monarch butterflies. But we're using the same thinking skills to answer these. So I'm on page 6 of your reading workbook, and it says to read the passage, then answer questions 1 through 6. Now you notice something a little different in this video. You have these numbers over to the sides. Those are paragraph numbers. So we can refer back to paragraph 1 or paragraph 3. They're just there to help you find your place in the article. Okay, this one is entitled Buckle Up. So there's my topic. That title has something to do with buckle up, which makes me think of seatbelts. Can you imagine your car without seatbelts? Can you imagine putting your precious newborn baby or favorite niece in the front seat of your car without anything to keep her securely in place? For most drivers today, seatbelts are commonplace. But that wasn't always the case. It wasn't that long ago that seatbelts were not standard equipment on passenger cars. Before 1966, seatbelts were not standard operating procedure in most cars. The history of seatbelts dates back to the 1800s. The first seatbelt was patented in 1885 by Edward J. Claghorn. He is credited with creating a seatbelt to keep tourists safe in taxis in New York City. Race car drivers were the first to realize the safety benefits of seatbelts, and the racing organization implemented mandatory seatbelt usage in 1954. Over time, seatbelts slowly started showing up in passenger cars. At first, seatbelts were considered optional equipment in cars. People could purchase them if they desired. Seatbelts were even sold at local gas stations. However, few Americans used them. History proves that public awareness of the benefit of seatbelts in the United States was low until 1955. That year, Hollywood actor James Dean was killed in a car crash, and many people said that the use of a seatbelt could have saved his life. This accident raised public interest in seatbelt safety. It also caused car manufacturers to begin testing seatbelts and to create more user-friendly versions. Crash testing proved that the use of seatbelts in an accident reduced injuries and fatalities. The public started paying attention. In 1966, Congress mandated that car manufacturers include seatbelts in all cars, but drivers and passengers often elected not to use them. There were no laws mandating seatbelt use. Instead, drivers and passengers were encouraged to use them. For more than 25 years, the National Safety Council ran advertisements encouraging drivers to buckle up. They used crash dummies to demonstrate what could happen in an accident with and without a seatbelt. But people still didn't buckle up. Wearing a seatbelt was inconvenient to most people because it felt confining and uncomfortable. But the facts didn't lie. Seatbelts really could save lives if they were used properly. As a result, almost all states passed seatbelt use laws by 1995, more than 100 years after the first seatbelt was invented. Okay, let's take a look at our paragraph. our first question. What was the purpose of the first seatbelt? Was it to keep race car drivers safe? To keep babies safe in car seats? To keep people safe in taxis? Or to keep movie stars safe? So the first seatbelt is what we're looking for. So let's look back in our passage. And I'm looking in paragraph 2, and here it says, the first seatbelt was patented by Mr. Claghorn. He is credited with creating a seatbelt to keep tourists safe in taxis in New York City. So for this one, I'm going to go with C, to keep tourists, their people, safe in taxis. So that one is clearly stated in the passage. You just have to find it. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I found that in paragraph 2. What is the main idea of paragraph 2? Despite the safety benefits, some people fail to wear seatbelts. Seatbelts date back to the 1800s. However, few Americans used them. Race car drivers realized that seatbelts provided safety. Most people are not aware of the safety benefits of wearing seatbelts. So let's look back at paragraph 2. The main idea is the history of seatbelts. They tell me when the first one was invented, and then they tell me that race car drivers used them, and then they tell me that over time passenger cars started using them. This is the history of the seatbelt. So, I'm going to go with B. Dates back to the 1800s, but few people used them. They were available, but not widely used. Okay, number 3. What is the main idea of paragraph 3? Crash testing helped prove that seatbelts could reduce injuries in an accident. James Dean's accident demonstrated that seatbelts can save people's lives. Car manufacturers wanted to create upgraded seatbelts for the public. Or public awareness of the benefit of seatbelts was very low prior to 1955. So we need to look back at paragraph 3. And look at that first sentence. History proves that public awareness, look at that, it's almost word for word what I'm looking for. Public awareness of the benefits of seatbelts was low until 1955. That is almost word for word what D is saying. And that is what I'm looking for. It did mention James Dean. That's definitely one of the details in this paragraph. But it also mentioned crash testing. And it mentioned manufacturers testing. And it mentions the public paying attention. These are tricky, guys. You have to really, really pay attention. Which is the main idea of paragraph 4? Drivers were reluctant to use seatbelts until laws were passed. Drivers were encouraged to use seatbelts. People thought seatbelts were uncomfortable. Mandatory seatbelt laws were put into effect in 1995. So let's look back at paragraph 4. And this is talking about mandating. That means making it a law. So we see that Congress said that car manufacturers had to include seatbelts, but there were no laws mandating the use of seatbelts. Drivers and passengers were encouraged. They used crash dummies. They used all kinds of things to try to get people, advertisements to get people to buckle up. But look at this. People still didn't buckle up. With all the efforts, people didn't do it when they had a choice. So as a result of that, states passed laws that took away the choice. You have to wear a seatbelt or risk getting a ticket. So, number 4, the best answer is A. They used crash dummies, they did advertisements, they told people you need to buckle up, but they didn't do it until laws were passed. Which detail from the passage best supports the idea that not all cars had seatbelts prior to 1966? So they're quoting from the passage. Race car drivers were the first to realize the safety benefits of seatbelts, and the racing organization implemented mandatory seatbelt usage in 1954. That's true, but we're not talking about race cars. We're talking about all cars. B, at first, seatbelts were considered optional equipment in cars. C, it also caused car manufacturers to begin testing seatbelts and to create more user-friendly versions. History proves that public awareness of the benefit of seatbelts in the United States was low until 1955. Not all cars had seatbelts because seatbelts were considered optional equipment. Owners could decide if they wanted to add them on. Today, you can choose if you want GPS or leather seats. In those days, you could choose if you wanted seatbelts or not. Times have changed, haven't they? Number 6. Goodness, this is a long one. What is the best summary of the passage, of the whole story? In other words, if I ask you to tell me in 1 or 2 sentences, what's this whole thing about? That's the one that we're looking for. So let's read them and see what we have. Edward Claghorn patented the first seatbelt in 1885. In 1955, a high-profile accident caused car manufacturers to begin testing seatbelts. In 1966, it was mandatory to have seatbelts in all cars. By 1995, most states had put seatbelt use laws into effect. So let's look back at our passage and pull out the dates. Now, I can tell you that in general, I like numbers, okay? I like statistics. I like facts when I'm looking for these kinds of things. So here's a date. There's 1966. Let me make that a little darker. That's too dark. There's a date. There's 1885, 1800s, 1954, 1955, 1966, 1995. I like this one because you see how those dates, that thread runs through the whole passage. So I think it might be A, but let's look at all of them. Hollywood actor James Dean died in a car accident, which raised awareness of the importance of seatbelts. Many people said that Dean would have lived if he had a seatbelt on. Not all cars had seat belts until 1966. The National Safety Council ran ads to try and convince people to wear seat belts. This one is true. Everything in there is accurate, but it's not enough. It doesn't talk about Mr. Claghorn. It doesn't talk about Congress. It doesn't talk about states and the laws. It's just not enough. It doesn't include everything. Remember when we did these and I told you that your main idea has to include every single piece of detail? That is what we're looking at in this case. B, while it's true, it's not enough. Crash dummies and a safety campaign were finally successful in convincing people to wear seat belts. The Buckle Up campaign worked. More than 100 years after the seatbelt was invented for cars, the government made it mandatory that everyone must wear seatbelts in cars. Again, all of this is true, but it doesn't mention Mr. Claghorn. It doesn't mention James Dean or the race car drivers. So it's true, but it's not enough. Seatbelts were patented in 1855, but they were not standard equipment in all cars. James Dean's death brought about public awareness of their benefits, and car manufacturers added them to many cars. However, people did not always use them. In 1966, mandatory seatbelt laws were put into effect. This one's kind of true. It doesn't mention the race car drivers. It doesn't mention the events that happened in 1995. It's true, but it's not complete. The one that covers everything, the one that takes into account all the details, is A. Okay, I'm going to stop this video because we have finished our passage about seatbelts, and then I'll start the second part of this lesson in the next video.